Marky Z, and welcome to another awesome episode today of the Rockin House. We have a special guest all the way from Northern Hollywood, California, Brian. We have MarkChristian. Brian, tell them all about this A-lister musician.
MarkChristian started out in the early days. He's been around since the late 70s doing session work with so many different people, and his versatility also includes bands like the Village People. Berlin comes into mind because he actually had a band with two of the Berlin musicians.
Big F.
This was 1988. This was before Kurt Cobain and his band Nirvana broke big. Yep. They had the grunge sound, so one of the earliest bands who did grunge was the Big F with MarkChristian as a guitar player.
Yes, absolutely.
In modern times, he switched over. His passion is country music, country picking, chicken picking.
Yeah.
Awesome player in the country field. So we're going to have MarkChristian, and he knows everybody around the music scene. So he's a very interesting fellow. He has a lot to say, and more people should know about MarkChristian. He's just one of them fantastic musicians everybody should know about.
Absolutely. So let's bring on MarkChristian to the Rockin House. Welcome to the Rockin House. This is Marky Z, and welcome to another awesome episode for Season 3 of the Rockin House. I have special guests with me all the way from North Hollywood, California, MarkChristian. Let me tell you, MarkChristian has his hand in a lot of cookie jars with a lot of known artists, and he's here to talk about it today live on the Rockin House. Mark, welcome to the show. We're glad to have you, brother, today.
It's great to be here. Greetings from North Hollywood, California.
Awesome, Mark. Awesome. Now, I'll tell you what, man. I want to start the show with how you started getting into playing guitar. You said it was all about the guitar. Let's talk about that to start everything on your career as a musician.
Well, that's pretty much a no-brainer. I grew up in the Southern California area in the 60s and 70s, which was a time when Los Angeles was just on fire with the music scene. You know all the bands, the Byrds, the Doors, you know, the Graham Parsons, the Wrecking Crew. This was all a part of my growing up. My neighbor, not far from where I lived, was Jose Feliciano.
Wow. And
he had a recording studio across the street from the music store I worked in when I was a kid.
Nice.
So that influence was coming in, right? So, and last but not least, we had Fender musical instruments about the next town over from my town. So
nice.
Fender guitars were everywhere, and you couldn't help but be born into the world of guitar back then. Not to mention the fact that, you know, you had already had your guitar heroes in the 60s and 70s.
Oh, yeah.
Everybody from Les Paul to Jeff Beck to Roy Clark to Jimi Hendrix. I mean, you name it, they just kept coming. So, being a kid, you know, this was kind of like my number one main interest. And I got my first guitar at the age of 9 years old, and I excelled immediately and had my first band in the 6th grade, which we got shut down by the cops. And, you know, I have to understand it.
Nice.
Back then, if you were playing rock music, right away the neighbors were calling the other neighbors, you know, wondering if the kid's going to grow up okay. You know, so different time back then. But my parents figured out that something was going on with the level that I was excelling at musically. I tried drums, I tried piano, you know, I tried a few different things, but the guitar just kind of blew up for me.
Right.
And just like now, everybody had a band. There was a band on every corner back then. but when we collected records, and we figured out right away that these people playing on these records that we had were all in Los Angeles, the session players.
Right.
So as soon as I was old enough to get a fake ID, we would drive up to Hollywood and go see Larry Carlton or Lee Ritenour or anybody we could find that was playing that had just played on a big record.
Right.
And so that just fueled the fire of guitar.
Exactly.
And then I was very fortunate in high school to join the high school jazz band, which was just a basic big band.
Right.
We made a recording. A mobile truck came up, but it's just like now. We were going to the music store and we were just admiring all the guitars. I wanted every guitar I saw that glittered and spoke to me. And a funny story: when I was about 10 years old, I wanted the guitar that Jimi Hendrix played. So my dad took me down to the music store and we couldn't find it. And we kept looking at it. Well, maybe that's it, maybe that's it over there. And it turned out that there was a whole row of Stratocasters. We just didn't recognize them because they weren't upside down.
Okay, that's funny. Yeah.
Yeah. Otherwise, I could have had like a Stratocaster that's worth a college education right now.
Yeah.
But I had to laugh. We couldn't find Jimi Hendrix's guitar because it wasn't upside down. Oh, well.
That's a great story.
I excelled immediately in high school. I was studying John McLaughlin and Larry Coryell and Les Paul, and I was studying jazz, and the guitar just consumed me.
Yeah.
And while the other kids were going out for sports or going out on dates, it was just all about getting together with the guys on the weekend when their parents would go away or something, and it was jam sessions all weekend. We would play Allman Brothers songs, we would play Johnny Winter songs, we would play Jimi Hendrix songs. The whole thing was just this incredible barrage of guitar all the way till the end of the 70s.
Right.
And I got a fake ID and I started playing nightclubs. And this fella comes up to me and he goes, because you're better than what this band. I got a real gig for you. And I said, well, what's that?
Wow.
And he said, a big Elvis impersonator just took over after Elvis died, and they need a second guitar player. You might want to take this gig because they're touring the world.
Wow.
So I wasn't a big Elvis fan at the time because I didn't really know that much about the 1950s.
Right.
Just being a kid,
Sure.
And so I got the gig and I toured the world and I figured out right away who James Burton and Scotty Moore was and how important that this music was to rock and roll just to begin with,
Right. Yep. Oh yeah.
And that was my ticket out of town. And we toured the world for about a year. And in 1980, we wound up at the famous Aquarius Theater in Hollywood. Now, by this time, there was an Elvis impersonator on every corner, so that was the end of that. And a friend of mine from high school gave my number to Stevie Wonder's producer.
Wow.
Bob Margoloff. Now, Bob Margoloff recorded the Stevie Wonder records in the 70s and kind of built the sound. He was a synthesizer genius, and he built this gigantic thing called Tonto. And it was multiple Moog synthesizers that could play polyphonic. It could play all the notes at once, which was unheard of at the time.
Right.
And so I'm working with this guy, right? So this is great. And he's producing a country singer. And that was my introduction into the session business. And he kind of took me under his wing and taught me how to play session guitar and how to think. Because in the studio, your thinking changes. And sometimes you don't perform so well because you're intimidated by all the stuff going on. It's just a weird thing. When the red light goes on, you start getting nervous, even though you're not on camera, you're still getting nervous.
Yeah.
And so the session career blossomed from there. The short story is I had met these guys on the road before I got to Hollywood that had a cover band, and they were in Chicago. And when I was on the road with the Elvis impersonator, they said, "Come see our new band." And so I went to see the new band. This is like 1979.
Okay.
And they had the mullets and the bell bottoms and the rock you bro, right? Yeah, and they said, what do you think of our band? I go, I think you guys are dated. I mean, this whole thing, rock and roll thing's dead, man. You got to get with the new wave sound, And I had my skinny tie and my spiky hair. And so a year later, I get a phone call from one of the band members that was my friend, and he said, "Hey, this is Frank. You know, remember that band that you made fun of?" And I go, "Yeah." He goes, "Well, we're in Los Angeles, and we got a record deal." And I go, "No shit, that's great." You know, and he goes, "Come on down to the studio. I want you to meet everybody." So I go down to the studio, and I witnessed the recording of The Eye of the Tiger. So it was Survivor.
Survivor.
So let that be a lesson to you. Don't ever judge.
Of course you don't know, because everybody in this business knows everybody. I already learned that, believe me. It's like one big close-knit family, this music business. And I'll tell you what, we're going to come back with MarkChristian in just a minute and talk about how he connected with Berlin and other main pop musicians in just a moment. Stay with us. Mark, what a cool first segment. We talked about how things started with the guitar and how you looked at that funny story with Jimi Hendrix. That was really cool. You couldn't find his guitar because he had everything, the other way, and those guitars are probably right in front of your face. But now, let's talk about how you got into some major known artists that became big. Probably on MTV would be this Berlin band, which we all know. They brought that new wave type of sound. They were all over MTV. I remember them very well. And, of course, there was a lot of other involvement that you mentioned, too. Let's talk about that now moving forward.
Well, just like any town, Hollywood can be a small town. And in my early session days, in the early 80s, I had a couple bands that were playing around, trying to get a record deal. And Rob Brill, who was the Big F drummer and the drummer towards the end of Berlin, used to play with us. So I had a connection there. And Rob knew that I was a session player, and he would hire me from time to time to play on Berlin's demos, which really...
That's the connection. Got it.
Which really made me scratch my head, because, why am I not playing on the record? Well, we get bigger name guys on the record, and right now you're doing the demos, so that's fine. So the session thing went really well for me, and I was getting a name for myself. And we get to the end of the 80s, and they finally call me for the Berlin record. Well, it's about time, right?
Okay, yeah.
And but what was going on was that it was just a compilation record, and I was going to play on the last bonus track for Berlin, the last song ever they were going to record. It's called Blowin' Sky High. That's me on the first track on the compilation record. And they brought in this amazing harmonica player. It's kind of a pretty cool blues tune.
Nice.
But they explained to me that this whole decade of music is over, and we want to do something new. And they were playing me the recordings of Soundgarden and Dinosaur Jr., and these bands weren't known yet.
Right.
And I being a session player, a studio person, I said, well, these bands, they sound like garage music. Nobody's going to sign this, this not polished.
Yep.
And they were explaining to me, no, you don't understand. This is what we want to do. We want to go back to the organic, good old organic rock sound, where there's no commercial programming of the music. And there's no music producer. We're going to produce it ourselves. Well, I like that idea. So,
right. Yeah.
We got a rehearsal room in North Hollywood and a 24-hour lockout, and we just started jamming, and we started to emulate our influences from all of us started playing music when we were kids. So you have to realize that in 1988, the 70s weren't that far away, and a lot of things that happened in the 70s were still alive in everybody's spirit. You know,
absolutely.
Jimi Hendrix, The Who, and then some of the newer bands that they liked were the Replacements and Motorhead. Motorhead was a big influence on the Big F. And talk about a sound. They used to call it the garbage truck on 10. That was Motorhead. So we got together and they said, well, what we're going to do is we're going to jam for a year, and we're not going to see the light of day. Well, that was fine with me because they took care of me financially, and you know, we had this big plan to have our own original sound, and it was great. You know, Rob got his double bass drums going, and I got a Marshall stack. All these things I always wanted to have, and have a real situation where I'm not just in a garage band hoping to be heard. I actually have some kind of future with these guys. So the jamming went on and on and on, and the songwriting started. Now, back then, I wasn't a lyricist or a singer, but John was singing and throwing out music ideas, and it was decided after failed attempts at trying to find a singer that he would just do the vocals. So he went and took vocal lessons from Ron Anderson, who had created the voice of Axl Rose and was the coach for Chris Cornell. And he was the vocal coach for all those big 90s voices, you know, and the screaming and all that stuff. So that was the final piece of the puzzle to add to the sound of the Big F. Was we had found our singer. And we had this great 3-piece band that was untouchable at the time. And the manager, our manager, Perry Watts Russell, who was Berlin's manager, had no problem getting the labels interested in the band. The only hurdle to climb was that they disguised themselves so that they weren't Berlin, which later they got busted for. But they just wanted to be 3 Joes on the Sunset Strip, you know. And first nobody knew who I was. So right away, the record came out on Elektra Records and was really well received by our peers. You know, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, Guns N' Roses, Nirvana, everybody, LA Guns, everybody loved the Big F. They always mentioned that the Big F was their new favorite band in all of their magazine interviews. But as time went on, in the next 4 years, all these bands blew up and we didn't. And so that was kind of the end of the Big F. I think John and Rob, already being rock stars, hiding as grunge rock stars, I think they just gave up. You know, it's like the AC/DC song, It's a Long Way to the Top If You Want to Rock and Roll, is no joke.
I love that
song. You know, it took 10 years for Berlin to get to a point where they just dismantled it. And now they think that the Big F is going to just blow up overnight, and it didn't. It's kind of popular now. You know, the irony is here we are 30 years later, and there's Big F fans. You know, but that's kind of how that whole thing came about. It's just the typical story of a session player like Dwayne Allman or Glenn Campbell or anybody else that did the session thing and then started doing their own thing. You know?
That's what I was going to say, Mark. To backtrack so the viewers understand how this Big F just came into the picture we've been discussing, is that spawned from Berlin musicians that you connected with that deal with them, correct?
That is correct. Berlin was originally a rebel rock band that was going to do it their own way. And they created the sequencer synthesizer sound back when it was just starting. And I think they did it in somebody's bedroom for cheap. And it's important to realize what John and Rob respected about Berlin is that they said that at one time, you know, there was nobody like them. They were doing their own thing. And this big radio station here at the time, K-Rock, was playing Berlin's music before they had a record deal, and they amassed a following on radio.
That's awesome.
And then all of the corporate people jumped in, you know, and that's how the success of Berlin went. And they wanted the same scenario for the Big F. They wanted the Big F to be this interesting, cool underground band that blew up, and it sort of happened, but obviously not the level that Berlin did.
Right.
But in all fairness to John and Rob, their quest for the Big F was the same as it was in the early days of Berlin. They just wanted to be respected for having their own unique idea and sound.
So let's talk about that before we go to our next break, and we're going to talk about what's in the future for MarkChristian and what he's doing now. Before we get to that, with the Big F, I had mentioned this to you when I heard it. It got that Nirvana meets a Danzig type of sound. And you said that this is before Nirvana was even around. So you basically honed that kind of a sound before Nirvana did. Is that correct?
That is correct. It was actually Nirvana bursting on the scene that kind of surprised us all, because we still didn't really know where music was going. You know, we were still in the shadows of the LA metal scene, which is Poison, Guns N' Roses, you know, and Motley Crue, and this still was pretty big, and the Seattle grunge sound was bubbling up, but it was not really big. It was pretty much, from what I can remember, it was pretty much Nirvana that broke through really big.
Yes.
Soundgarden was a force to be reckoned with, but they weren't big yet, like they ended up being by like the mid '90s.
Agree with that. All right, well, Mark, we're going to come back and we're going to talk about the new album. Trash Talking Guitar, Merle Jagger, is that correct? And
that is Trash Talking Guitars.
Awesome. And we're going to talk about how you went from the Big F, I guess after that crumbled out of the situation, like you said, these guys didn't go where you wanted to, you went back into the country scene. And we're going to come back and talk about that, where it's at right now in the future. In fact, in just a moment.
Bold colors wore a red bandana and a gold tooth in her smile. I said something silly, yeah, you look like Mary Poppins. From that moment on, you are mine. You got a two-spine money shot, run, Johnny, run. Two-spine money shot, run, Johnny, run. She accepts an invitation for some wine and conversation. Suspiciously I oblige. She says a woman's greatest gift gives her power of seduction.
All right, this is Marky Z again, and it's a pleasure having MarkChristian here on our show so far, discussing some amazing things I'm learning myself that I had no idea you were involved this deep in the music business, besides what I've seen. It's awesome. Now let's talk about how you seen things crumble for the Big F, and you thought that might have been where it's going to go, but all these other bands like Nirvana and Soundgarden and other ones you mentioned that got bigger for some reason, and you guys didn't, but you went back into the country scene. And now you put out this new album, which is the Trash Talking Guitars, and it's pretty awesome. It's kind of like a rhythmy blues rock, but chicken picking at its best. I guess that's a good way to say it. Let's talk about that.
That's pretty good. I like that.
I try to do the best I can explaining people's music, man, from what I see and understand. I do my homework, Mark. Let's talk about
Trash Talking Guitars is the big firework in the box of all my influences that are coming out.
I love it, man. A Hillbilly 9 is awesome.
Yeah, that was the first Merle Jagger release, 2006.
Nice.
The short story is, after the Big F, we had produced our own records, so bands were calling me up to produce, so I became a music producer. And nice. I got another band signed that I actually jumped in as guitar at the end of the 90s. But a friend of mine that was a session player was the bass player for Dwight Yoakam.
Okay.
And so I used to do sessions with his musicians from time to time.
Nice.
And they introduced me to the two gentlemen that built the studio for Dwight Yoakam, which at the time, at the end of the 90s, was a big studio in town in Burbank called Mad Dog Studios.
Okay.
And everybody was recording there. The Damned, Robin Ford, Dwight Yoakam. It was a great place to hang out. And it was there that I started the Merle Jagger Band because at the end of the decade of the 90s, just like the 80s, I saw the end of an era. And I wanted to go back to my roots because the Big F was actually my roots. You know,
Yep.
There was no pedal board. There was no frills. There was no thrills. It was just a 1960 Stratocaster into a 1975 Marshall stack. That was my sound, and it was all done with my fingers.
Mm-hmm.
And I was really admiring at the time the country pickers were kind of the same kind of player where there was it's all in the hands, you know.
Yeah.
It's just a simple guitar and a simple amp. And I was hearing all these guys, including Pete Anderson at the time. So I thought I would start an instrumental country band, art for art's sake only. And I kind of had given up on the rock and roll thing. You know, it's okay now. I'm turning 40 years old. Here comes the year 2000. I don't want to be some kind of aging old rocker that never made it or whatever, you know.
Yeah.
Although that's certainly changed. So rock and roll is here to stay. But I didn't know that at the time. So I went back to my roots and I started this band. It was kind of celebrating Danny Gatton, Roy Buchanan, Joe Maphis, Jimmy Bryant, you know, all the Telecaster, Guitar Hero, country guys. I was going for it. And I was trying to think of a band name that would describe the music.
Right.
And I was always a fan of bands names like Mazzy Star or Elvis Costello. These aren't real people that exist. They're just names that make me laugh, you know, or they were funny. And so one of the big influences for me from day one since I was a kid was Merle Travis, the great Merle Travis picking style that he had. So that's what the Merle stands for. A country picker meets rock and blues and country. Jagger sums it all up. And there was no relationship to the band name to Merle Haggard, although a friend of mine told me that he heard of us and laughed and said, that's a great band name. So God bless Merle. And
cool.
And so Merle Jagger was born. And just like the 80s and the 90s, Hollywood had this new music scene. And all of the long hair was replaced by cowboy hats. And all of a sudden, there's a million country bands in Los Angeles, and they're all in their 20s. Like, where did all these people come from? But this is great, right? And the country scene was celebrating. A lot of it was celebrating the country scene that was born out of Los Angeles from the late 40s to the mid 70s. You know, the Merle Haggard, Buck Owens, Wanda Jackson, the Maddox, Rose Maddox, the Graham Parsons, Poco, the Eagles. It's all the Byrds. This is all L.A. This stuff was going on here. Wish I could have been around back then to experience it, but I wasn't old enough.
Yeah.
This was the new hipster scene in Hollywood, and so my band fit perfect because we had no singer, and we were playing country music, but not very many people knew what the hell it was we were trying to do.
Yeah. We
even opened for the Tennessee Three once when we were still an instrumental band, and I was honored to shake the drummer's hand, and he looks at me and he goes, "Yeah, what kind of country music is it that you guys do anyway? What do you call that?" I don't think he liked what we were doing, but I also played banjo. And so the Hillbilly Number 9 song is a banjo picking on the telly because I thought, well, who's doing that, right? Nobody's doing that.
No.
So believe it or not, I started my own country night, which blew up, and then an indie label came and signed Merle Jagger to an instrumental record deal, and you just can't make this stuff up, right? So now I'm back in the game, and we're on all the college radio stations, and we're touring. And so I started singing. So trash talking guitars is another name like Merle Jagger to explain what's going on. What's going on is if you're a Merle Jagger fan and you suddenly hear vocals, don't be alarmed. You still get the crazy guitar stuff. Right. The album was originally going to be called Guitars and Trash Talk, like, Guitars and Cadillacs, Guitars and Trash Talk.
Okay.
So everybody would, because my lyrics are kind of a parody on loss, misery, disappointment, heartache, all that country stuff. I kind of have satire lyrics. So my drummer mentioned, well, it's easier just say trash talking guitars, rolls off the tongue better, and that one won. And so that's what the album title is, to explain this transition from instrumental music to vocal music.
Very cool. Well, I'll tell you what, we're going to close our show, and I have one last question to discuss with you, is how did you make the connection with Willard Snow? We had him on our show with an awesome guy, an amazing artist to these, some of the major artists out there like Pink's Mark Schulman had a Gretsch drum head done by him that was discontinued.
Yeah, Willard's great.
Yeah.
He's
How did that connection
artist.
happen with you? I guess because
that happened because Merle Jagger amassed a following of guitar and people that admire guitar, and specifically the Telecaster, which was my guitar of choice at the time for 20 years. I've moved on to a couple of other interesting guitars, but I still play the Telecaster. And the funny thing about Merle Jagger is people would come to the shows and bring me Telecaster parts. Here's a pickup. Here's a neck. I just wanted you to have this. It's a knob.
That's so
whatever.
Cool, man.
Or they would bring a Telecaster. Go, I'd give anything if you would play my guitar. Sure.
Wow.
And Willard, he showed up to a show once, and he had this beautiful guitar that he said he did the artwork on. Right. And I played it, and he took some pictures and video. There's some video of it somewhere.
Nice.
And then we've been friends ever since.
That's how that connection was, and I seen that Telecaster.
That's how we got connected to you guys. So
awesome. Well, you know what? Yeah. I think that's a great way to end our show. I appreciate you coming to the show and being our guest. It was awesome having you, Mark. I'm Marky Z with my partner, Rock Dude, and we are out.
Red